to be the Arakun project because they wanted to move back to their land, and I helped them do that. After that, I helped set up the North Queensland Land Council, along with Mick Miller, Clary Grogan and Peter Noble, and that we had representation on all of the remote Aboriginal communities from the councils. And so that was many years, and then later on I was CEO of the Aboriginal Coordinating Council for a number of years.
What's your background, just for me, in my mind? So were you what had you done in terms of training and work before you came to North Queensland?
Yes, so I'm qualified as a psychologist, and I have worked in that capacity, also as a sociologist, which is where a lot of the research comes in.
Yeah.
And also as a mediator, doing a lot of work with families and workplaces to sort out disputes, and I'm also a pastor. So I wear lots of hats.
You do. Well, you've got your 11th book that is ready for release, Secrets and Lies, the shocking truth of recent Australian Aboriginal history, and it's a memoir. It's part 2 of your memoir. It's a great title, Secrets and Lies, and we're going to get into one or two of the secrets and lies that you cover off of in your book. But just an overarching question, I mean, it's a great time to be having the discussion in Reconciliation Week. You've been working in the space of sharing, of truth-telling for decades. How far do you think we've come in terms of the truth-telling element to reconciliation?
I think we still have a ways to go with that, and there are a number of good books out as well as mine at the moment. I think a lot of it's a shock to the people of Australia to really come to grips with the history of the nation. Even just things like people have difficulty accepting that the British colonised Australia. But if you have a look at it, it was a British colony, and colonised comes from colony. Even just that one factor is something really difficult for
Why
Australians
do you think it's such a
to
hurdle
realise.
for some Australians to accept?
Well, partly because of guilt of what's happened to First Nations people, and also because there's a view out there that we're not responsible for what our forefathers have done. But one of the things that a saying that we used to hear a lot was Australia rode on the sheep's back. Well, I would say Australia rode on the back of Aboriginal people because of the resources from the land which was taken, and also for slave labour, which really did occur as well. So there's a lot to unpack.
Not only that, I mean, apparently a lot of the inland roads and highways and trade routes are actually ancient kind of super highways that Indigenous Australians were using, and they were kind of shown to the early settlers. And there's a lot of what we know of Australia as today that actually owes to the first Australians, the First Nations people.
Oh, absolutely. And Norman has a lovely painting, We Gave Water, because a lot of the first settlers didn't know where to find water, and Aboriginal people helped them to survive on the land as well.
You have worked in North Queensland for decades, and particularly through some really tumultuous times in the 70s and 80s when it came to recognition, rights of Indigenous Australians. You've got a new book out called Secrets and Lies. Run us through the story of passive resistance in Arakun in the 70s and what you think that signifies. Tell us the backstory there.
Look, it was absolutely amazing story, and I really felt I had to tell it, and I've actually devoted the first 4 chapters of the book to that story. It is such an amazing one, and the voices of Aboriginal people from Arakun and Mornington Island come out strongly. The prejudices of state government ministers as well, and the fight with the Commonwealth and the fight with the Uniting Church, where the state wanted to take over from the church. But the resistance was amazing. Having already taken the Queensland government to court because they didn't want mining at Arakun, and they won the case, and the church helped them, the Uniting Church. And so Bjelke-Petersen government was just so angry about that. They decided to take over the community, and the people said no, we want the church to stay because they're helping us transition to self-government, and they're allowing us to go back to our tribal land, and the state government was not prepared to do that because they were fear-mongering about a black state. And so what the people did at Arakun is that the council went and actually occupied the airstrip. The chairman, Donald Pinekina, put a tent at the airstrip. Other councillors occupied the store, the post office, any areas of significance where the government might like to try and come in, and put notices up and say, we live here, this is private property, you are not welcome. So they withdrew the welcome mat. There were so many things that happened. When the Premier tried to go to Mornington Island, the council refused to meet him, and they went out bush.
Was this fraught with danger at the time?
Oh, yes, it was, because what happened is Bjelke Peterson just abolished the councils. And and he put in administrators. They wouldn't cooperate with the state government, they wouldn't cooperate with the administrators. A year later, when elections were held, those two communities voted back in the same councils and the same chairman. So there was such strong resistance. The voices that came out in that community were amazing. And they took the Queensland government to court for sacking them, the councils as well.
What does that passive resistance suggest to you all these years on, looking back at that episode, 1978, Queensland? What does that passive resistance, what are the echoes of that through to today for you?
Well, I think it's the strength of the community. They weren't going to be intimidated by the Queensland government, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. Now, Gladys Taipingumba at the time, she said, if my grandfather was alive, he would spear you. But we don't do that today. They used passive resistance and court cases instead, but a very strong community. And Mornington Island was too. And since the state government came in, those two communities have deteriorated quite a lot. One of the reasons was because Hinds, the local government minister, insisted that they have a canteen there because it gave them the same human rights as everybody else.
It's interesting that there's been, the new mayor on Mornington Island's been begging the state government to come up and have a look at what he says is a really torrid situation for Mornington Islanders, and the Premier has promised that there will be very high level representation coming to Mornington Island. So all these years on, we've got a Premier probably welcome in Mornington Island. In 78 it wasn't the case. But you say that a lot of the issues with the government, a lot of the issues with the governance of these communities stem from that time.
It does, and you know, there's been a number of ABC reports actually, if you look back through the history of where they've seen the deterioration of those communities since the state government has forced the church out and come and taken over. A lot of social problems have developed since then. Now, whether Anastasia Palaszczuk will be as welcome as you suggest, I don't know. I think she'll get a bit of a bagging at first because of what she's allowed to have happen there, her administration. But yes, of course, they will be pleased for some action, which is long overdue.
We're hearing here from Barbara Miller, a historian, psychologist and sociologist who has worked for a long time in the space of truth-telling when it comes to First Nations stories, particularly in North Queensland. She's got a new book out. It's a memoir, Secrets and Lies, its main title, The Shocking Truth of the History of First Nations People in Australia. In your book, you do really document some of the quite nasty things that were said about First Nations people in Parliament by state MPs. And this is from an era that has thankfully gone, but take us back through some of the hurtful things.
Yes, well, there could be other things. I've only really looked at what happened during the Arakun and Mornington Island dispute. There could have been some nasty things later on as well. But in 1978, Mr. Bob Moore said that Aboriginal people produced babies and we have to pay for it. They don't produce anything productive. He also said, quote, "If someone had burnt the history books, the Aborigines would not be any the wiser. They do not read. Someone has to tell them that they have the right of ownership." I mean, that is such a racist statement. Actually, the people at Arakun and Mornington Island in that day were very well educated. They didn't need anyone to tell them, because they were knew very well that generations and generations of their forefathers and foremothers had owned that land.
Can you imagine? I mean, it just wouldn't be accepted, any politician saying something like that today. There have been in more recent times comments that have come from some politicians that have been deemed to be racist. But was 1978 a different era in Australia?
Well, it was a different era. I think they would have a lot more difficulty getting away with it today. But it was amazing what they got away with in the Bjelke-Petersen era. Would you like to hear a couple more statements? Okay, Martin Teeney, closer to home, member for Barron River, said that Aboriginal people love filth, quote, and they wreck houses, and quote, "I say very definitely that in Australia today there is discrimination against whites. I'm no more racist than anyone else. All I ask for is there be equal rights and privileges for all." Okay, that's an idea of what was coming out. Scott Young from Townsville, quote again, "Anybody who claims to have Aboriginal blood automatically receives a handout. Previously, a half-caste was not recognised by his race. He was not accepted, and the women were not even listened to at all." And Bjelke-Petersen talked about a reign of terror.
So talk about this black nation that the government was worried about. For those of us that either weren't around or weren't familiar with what was going on at the time, what was the concern from the government?
Well, basically the background was that the federal government had put in the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, and so Bjelke-Petersen's government was very concerned that that was going to create a black state, and if Aboriginal people in Queensland moved back to their tribal land, which was happening in Arakun and other places, that it would create a black state, particularly when they wanted self-management or self-government.
And so this was kind of part of the element of the lies that you go into. You say there was a lot of manipulating of the truth at the time to fit certain agendas. Run us through the battle between the Queensland and federal government at the time, and some of the lies that you say in your book actually plagued this.
Well, it was quite amazing. One of them was Dr. Edwards, who was the health minister in Queensland, said that the reason they went into Arakun and Mornington Island was regarding health. But the Uniting Church wasn't responsible for health, he was. But anyhow, the real reason came out in the paper that it was a policy conflict between the state and the church. Also, Porter, who was the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs at the time, he said in Parliament, quote, "The Federal Department of Aboriginal Affairs is riddled with left-wing communist activists who have been put there in the Whitlam days." This was quoted also in The Australian on the 21st of April 1978.
But this was a Conservative federal government at the
time. I know, this was a Liberal government, and this was a National Party state government, but the vitriol was incredible, absolutely incredible, and the stoush was absolutely amazing, because I've read the federal and the state Hansards as well as the newspapers at the time, and the federal government actually said that they would take over Arakun and Mornington Island. Well, not take over. What they said they would do was enact self-management legislation, which is what the people wanted there. But Bjelke-Petersen, he knew how to win an argument by bluster or whatever. What he did, and Mick Miller, chairman of the North Queensland Land Council, warned that this was going to happen, because the reason I was so involved was because of my involvement with the Land Council, and we had a huge campaign on this issue. But Bjelke-Petersen abolished the reserves of Arakun and Mornington Island. which meant the federal self-management legislation couldn't work because it was based on the fact of them being reserved. So there was all these machinations backwards and forward, and I go into it. It's absolutely fascinating and absolutely appalling, this incredible stoush between the federal and state government. In fact, Bjelke says, look, Fraser is even worse than Whitlam.
He says that at one point.
Yes, he does.
And it's a massive fight over the control of Indigenous communities at the time, or the direction of Indigenous communities at the time. We're talking about the late 70s here. How much of the challenges that we see in remote communities today do you attribute to what was going on way back in the late 70s?
Well, I do, because there has been a decline in all the social indicators that you could have a look at since this particular period. And not only that, like this is all in living history, although some of the elders have passed on, and my book does give them voice, but living history of people that, you know, you stand up for your rights and the Queensland government just smashes you, because that's basically what happened.
Talk us through. Now, you say that the part of the challenge with reconciliation is that there are many Australians that don't want to acknowledge the past, or aren't familiar with the events of the past, and as such they're not necessarily as accepting as others when it comes to reconciliation. You say a big part of the guilt that a lot of people either consciously or unconsciously carry relates to the treatment of First Nations people, including slavery. Now, you believe slavery occurred, but in your book, are there denials of slavery of Indigenous people that you've been able to uncover that were on the public record?
I actually haven't looked at current denials, but I know in 1978 Senator Arthur Geitzel in federal parliament actually said that he thought the situation in Queensland for Aboriginal people was one of near slavery.
When we say slavery, what are we talking about? You
Okay,
say that you know, Australia was said to have rode on the sheep's back. The case could be made that we rode on the First Nations people's back because so much labour was kind of, well, people were used as unpaid or little paid labour. I mean, we've seen in recent times stolen wages claims that would tend to suggest that that there was something going on there.
Yes, and I've got a lot in my book about that. I will say, I want to preface it by saying I believe there's a great deal of goodwill in Australia in terms of reconciliation. That's definitely there. We've got the walk across the bridges by thousands in the year 2000. We've got the apology by Kevin Rudd, which had a great healing wave. But the closing the gap is the big issue, I believe, at the moment, because that has not worked very well to reduce the inequality. But getting to your question, I'm just going to give a practical example. My husband Norman's grandfather, Thomas Miller, he was taken from his parents and he was forced to work for a cattle property owner at the age of 5 or 6. The same thing happened to my son, grandfather, McMillan Senior. I mean, that's child labour as well as being slave labour, and that was not uncommon. The other thing you have with the stolen generation, many of the children worked forced labour for extremely little income. The movie Lousy Little Sixpence gives you an idea of the pocket money they received at the time. There's a number of different things. There's also the underpayment of award wages in Queensland. There's also the issue of, and there has been some redress for that, but not quite enough. But there's also the other issue of wages being withheld. So for many Aboriginal people, their wages were withheld and went into the Aborigines Welfare Fund.
Which could be used to fund roads and hospitals at the time.
Yes, mostly for the white community. And this was Aboriginal people's labour, their wages. So often they were held, they had to go along to the police station and he might dole out a bit of money for them, representing the government. And so
you have to go to the police to get your wages in some communities.
Oh, to get money out of your bank book. Yes. And I remember the police station burning down at Cohen back in these times, back in the late 70s. People thought they were trying to hide something, that it was not just an accident. But that's another story. But the thing is, intergenerational poverty is a huge issue for First Nations people, which affects their health, physical and mental, affects family life, affects a whole lot of areas. And so when you look at what happened with underpayment of award wages, with forced labour, all of this, it's no wonder we've got the intergenerational poverty and trauma that we have today.
We've been hearing from Barbara Miller, who is a historian with a new book out, her 11th book. It's called Secrets and Lies, The Shocking Truth of Recent Australian Aboriginal History. And this is recent history. You haven't gone right back to the colonial times.
No, I'm looking at 1975 through to 2021, so it's absolutely right up to date as to now.
When we hear about the need for truth-telling in the greater discussion around reconciliation, it's hard for people to wrap their heads around what that might mean necessarily. Are you hoping that your book might go some way to giving people a little bit more understanding for what was happening?
I am, absolutely, and I've written it as a memoir so that my personal story is weaved into it, because that usually helps to make it more readable and interesting for people. But I am going to put out another edition as a schools edition, which will take my personal story out of there. Well, I hope it would be used by schools.
Yeah, it's remarkable to think that you came to North Queensland in 1974, a white woman trying to seek to address some of the inequality and work with Indigenous Australians. Was that pretty unique and rare at the time for you, Barbara, to be in these communities and playing that role?
It probably was. I remember the first time I went to Arakun in 1974, and an old man called Eric Coela, who's one of the people I write about in the book, and he actually took me around the community and introduced me to people. And then a lady called Violet Yankaporter, she took me down river to show me some of the sacred sites they wanted to protect from mining. And she took the sweat from under her arm and put it on me, and she said, "This is to keep you safe from these spirits attached that are protecting the sacred sites." So that was my first introduction to Arakun. So it's got a very special place in my heart.
Absolutely. And you, in more recent times, you have taken to history writing and to sharing stories through books. How much further do you think we have to go when it comes to truth-telling as part of the greater push towards treaty and reconciliation?
I think there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think probably if I was to do something, and you know, I don't know how many more books I'll do, but I think looking at all the people's arguments against the history of what's happened, the truth of the history, and just answering them one by one might be a good way to go.
Well, they say history is written by the victors. Do you think that's certainly been the case for Australian history up to now? I mean, the victors is maybe not the right word, but they say that history is written by the people in the power to do it at the time.
Yes.
Has that plagued our understanding of the past in Australia, do you think?
Yes, it definitely has, but we have a lot more Aboriginal writers coming out now, which is a really good thing.
All right, Barbara, that's all I had to ask. Thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you.
I learned a lot there.